All right, my friends, here for the AP US History Unit 5 quiz review. Going to try to fly through Manifest Destiny and some causes of the Civil War to let you know what will be on your quiz on Monday when we come into class. We start out with the overall Unit 5 concepts as a whole. This idea that the United States is going to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This has been sort of a continuing idea through class with things like the Louisiana Purchase. But now this is like fully fledged the goal of the United States. We believe that Manifest Destiny is essentially our God-given right to spread democracy, capitalism, Christianity across the North American continent to get us to that Pacific Ocean. And that is the overall belief in the time period, is that it's the Americans' right and duty from God to expand these principles outward into these territories. Another big thing that we're going to focus on is the causes of the Civil War, the expansion of federal power that the Civil War creates, and eventually how Reconstruction is a failure for the U.S. But for now, we're basically focusing on the first two for your quiz. Why can people move west in the first place? Well, you can now. There are now like easier avenues of doing so. You have railroads. You have trails that people have blazed, like the Oregon Trail, for you to follow. People have a ton of available land out west. There's more opportunities specifically for immigrants. Like we see a large German population contingent settle in like the Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois area, where they set up a whole bunch of farms and stuff. The East is already pretty overcrowded with increased immigration. So, a lot of opportunities and the good land have been bought up. So moving out west gives you more opportunity, specifically when we eventually find gold, which will be at the end of this slide. And again, there's just overall cultural belief that we are spreading our progress outward. America's progress would be a really good extra credit question. Would be like, name the painting that's most associated with Manifest Destiny. But essentially, you see like Lady Liberty here spreading education and technology across the continent to the detriment of things like the Native American population and culture, as well as like the buffalo population. That is going to be decimated, both of those things. We can see that here in the creepy version of that drawing, but, accurate as well. There are a group of Americans who are against expansionism in the first place. This is a consistent argument in U.S. history, especially when we get to like imperialism and the U.S. spreading outside of the continent for land. It's this idea that the U.S. does not want to take on more mouths to feed, essentially. These group of Americans known as the nativists, or the people that believe in nativism, they form a political party known as the Know Nothing Party, sometimes called the America Party. Is basically going to believe that like the white Europeans, specifically from England, are the actual Native Americans, and that every time we take in different immigrant groups, this includes, by the way, like Irish, Italians, and Germans. So, it's a wide encompassing, they don't like groups of people. It's more people to educate. It's more people to take care of. It's more people that they have to use what's known as the white man's burden on, or this idea that like these British white Americans need to take care of these immigrant populations and educate them and give them jobs and all that stuff. So that is what the nativists believe. And if you know nothing about the Know Nothing Party, they don't like immigrants, specifically Irish Catholics. Anyways, in order for us to secure the borders of the U.S., we're going to have a series of events that come about. So specifically on your test, I'm going to ask you, on your quiz, can you list the 4 ways in which the U.S. expanded territory? I'm going to go through those now. One, we settle some through like diplomatic means. We signed treaties such as the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which is going to set the border with Maine. Our boy James K. Polk comes into the presidency after this and has real goals of like setting the boundaries of the U.S. Another treaty we signed is with England in the Oregon Territory with the 54-40 or fight, which is guaranteed to be on your quiz. Rallying cry that we need to settle the land border with England. Basically, the U.S. takes the same strategy that they do in Texas, that they do in Oregon. They're going to move a whole bunch of Americans into the area, essentially overwhelming whatever the population was there already, and claim the area for ourselves. So anyways, 54-40 or fight ends up at the 49th parallel, but it's still like an overall victory for the U.S. in the sense that we set the northern border of the U.S. with Canada now, right? Which then leads to like a spike in immigration moving westward, which we saw on like the Oregon Trail in the series, the game we played there. We also, acquire land not only through treaty, but through annexation. Texas is going to become its own country. Mexico gets its independence from Spain. Texas then gets its independence from Mexico. creating what's known as the Lone Star Republic, which is why they have one star on their flag. And Texas has a very independent mindset as a state even now, because they were actually their own country for 8 years or so before becoming a part of the U.S. The one thing that occurs in there is the Battle of the Alamo. Remember the Alamo, which is a defeat for the Texans, but overall inspires people to join into the fight and eventually gets Texas their independence. Once Texas becomes independent, we do annex them, meaning we add them into the country. They basically ask to be added, and we agree to add them in. This is really going to annoy Mexico. And then we're going to have like a whole border dispute with Texas in this area you can see here on your screen called the Nueces Strip. Basically, the Americans think that Texas ends at the Rio Grande, where the arrow is pointing, and the Mexicans think that the territory of Texas, the state of Texas, should end at this blue line here, the Nueces River. And we have some issues in this area that eventually causes the Mexican-American War. So some causes of the Mexican-American War as we're adding land. The issue with Texas, for sure. The annexation of Texas is definitely a big cause. And, the Americans' continued movement out westward. Lincoln also questions the cause of the Mexican-American War through the spot resolution, where Lincoln is going to point on a map and say, show me the spot in which the fighting in Texas took place. If it's on one side, we don't deserve to go to war. If it's on the other, we should go to war. He eventually votes against going to war, by the way. He was only in the House of Representatives for 2 years. This would be another really good extra credit question. What was Lincoln's political life like before becoming president? He's a loser. He loses a whole bunch of elections except for one. Where he serves as a one-term congressman from Illinois. That'll come back up in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Anyways, we do try to buy Texas. We send John Slidell down to Mexico. Not to buy Texas. To buy California, New Mexico, Arizona, all that good stuff, and solve the issue of Texas in doing so. Mexico says no, even though we try to buy it in the first place. It's a good American excuse to be like, oh, well, we tried to buy it. So, anywho, the Mexican-American War is not too significant in the things that you need to know about it. It's basically a 2-year conflict that the U.S. completely dominates. We're able to raise the flag over Mexico City, mostly because we have a Navy and they don't. And then some Civil War generals that are going to come back later do get their experience fighting in this war. So that is maybe a little note to make. But we are able to acquire all this area here in orange, the Mexican cession, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and California. That land ends up being worth a lot. And we get that through violent conflict. So that's now the third way we've acquired land. We annexed Texas, we settled border disputes with Oregon and Maine, and we acquired the Mexican cession through violent means in war. We do see slavery immediately start to become an issue. Because this guy Wilmot tries to put in a clause that says that we cannot expand slavery into the newly created Mexican cession. This vote fails, but it's just an example of the slave issue taking hold, which we'll cover here at the end. Right, it is a failure. We did miss a couple things as we go through the Gadsden purchase. We buy this little piece of the south part of Arizona and New Mexico for the Transcontinental Railroad. So that is the last way we acquire land. We purchase it, like in the Gadsden purchase, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican-American War. The only other thing that comes up here is the California Gold Rush. Basically, once gold is discovered in California, the movement westward increases dramatically. So that's the Mexican-American War and your causes for it and its effects, but also like how the U.S. acquires land. We also looked at pre-Civil War compromises, which I'll pull up really quick for you here. Compromises over slavery that occur leading up to the Mexican-American War, the ones I really want you to know. The Missouri Compromise, it's this idea that no state above the state of Missouri can have slavery, but except for Missouri, and Maine is added. Remember, the whole issue here at first, this would be a really good quiz question. So I would probably pay attention to this. Again, really good quiz question. How does the issue of slavery transform? So it originally starts out as like a political issue in the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's like a representation thing, right? Like, are we going to have equal representation in the House of Representatives? That's why we need to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. It then also becomes a political issue in the Missouri Compromise, trying to keep the balance of power in the Senate by basically saying, hey, if you add a slave state, you need to add a free state as well to keep the balance of power so no one side dominates. It also becomes an economic issue because laborers in the North are specifically arguing that the slavery brings down wages. So it is an economic issue to them. So slavery definitely starts out as like a political or economic issue, and then we'll take here in a second how it becomes much more of a moral issue eventually, right? We also have the Compromise of 1850, which I do want you to know. Basically, the Compromise of 1850 is going to allow California into the country as a free state. It also includes a huge, huge provision of the Fugitive Slave Act. This is going to be a big deal for the North specifically, and eventually when we get to Dred Scott. But again, it's the idea that like the South can come into the North and recapture their slaves and bring them south. It also like leads to a series of bounty hunters chasing down slaves throughout the North. And the North really feels like it steps on their state's rights to ban slavery, because if you're hunting down slaves in the North, you're basically allowing slavery to happen. So the North is a huge, huge not fan. They do not like the Fugitive Slave Act. It's going to be a big cause of the Civil War. We also have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which calls for popular sovereignty. It's this idea that people that in the states can now vote if their state is going to have slavery or not, which then causes a whole bunch of people to move into the Kansas-Nebraska area that are pro-slavery or anti-slavery, and they have a whole bunch of violence. Let's lead to the term bleeding Kansas, or this idea that like over the slavery issue, voting for slavery or not is going to lead to some violent tensions, all leading to Civil War stuff, which we're eventually going to get into here. So those are the compromises I definitely want you to know. We also in class went through different lead up to the Civil War and really showed you how slavery became like more of a moral issue. The newspaper, The Liberator, written by William Lloyd Garrison, is a big factor in this. It's going to be the biggest abolitionist newspaper, or people who want to get rid of slavery. They're going to find a lot of the things that are anti-slavery in there. We also looked at Frederick Douglass, who is a freed slave that is highly, highly skilled and intelligent in the time period, and is a big abolitionist for getting rid of slavery, and is also an example of like, there was this whole narrative then that people of color just could not be as intelligent as white people. That was not possible. Obviously, that's a ridiculous argument. And I told you about the different ways they tried to prove that. But Frederick Douglass is the shining example that that's not true. Anybody with education, anybody with effort and time can become very, very well educated and outspoken. So Frederick Douglass, a great example of this, and is really seen as like a rallying point for the abolitionist movement. We also see Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is definitely going to have a huge impact on slavery becoming a moral issue. The book is a bestseller, and it is basically outlines like the life of an American slave. This whole book gets passed around Europe as well, which exposes the rest of the world to like what American slavery is like, and leads to a whole bunch of people against slavery as a moral thing. It really characterizes slaves as people, and they have families, and they love their children, and all that stuff, which is going to be much more relatable to people. Anyways, the other thing we saw is Dred Scott versus Sanford. The Dred Scott case is one of the Supreme Court cases that you have to know. Basically, Dred Scott sues the U.S. federal government, saying that he was a slave that was brought into free territory and established a life, therefore he should be free. And the Supreme Court makes their worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court by basically saying that Dred Scott is a black man. Black people are not people. Therefore, they can't be citizens. Therefore, they can't file a lawsuit in federal court. I'll let you, think about how disgusting that is as a statement in the first place. But essentially, Dred Scott gets rid of any rights for any black Americans. They are not considered citizens at all after Dred Scott, which is going to have the effect of dividing the Democratic Party in half, sending half of them to the Republican Party, joining up with the Whigs, and the formation of the Republican Party as a whole, as they now see slavery as a moral issue. We then end with a couple other issues, like the fight in Congress, not too important in the sense that people are going to ask you about it, but it just continues to show the sectional tensions between the two. We also have the Lincoln Douglas debates, which is going to show Lincoln as like this national figure now, because people follow the Lincoln Douglas debates in the newspapers, and that's how he becomes like very popular. Again, like I said, he had only won one election previous to becoming president. This is how Lincoln really becomes more of a household name, is through these Lincoln Douglas debates that people follow in the newspaper, right? And he basically says a house divided against itself cannot stand. That would also be another good extra credit question. The South interprets this as he wants to go after slavery, even though he clearly states he wants to stop the spread of slavery. So when he gets elected in 1860, the South thinks he's coming after their slaves, and they immediately secede. We lastly covered the raids of John Brown. John Brown is a very strong abolitionist who was fighting in like Bleeding, Kansas, came back east and tried to start a slave rebellion in Harper's Ferry, which fails. He's captured by, Robert E. Lee, future Confederate general head, and tried for treason and eventually hung. He is, seen as a martyr by the North, somebody who's like representative of their cause, willing to die for abolition, and he's seen as as a bad figure in the South, showing like what basically the North wants to